Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out to the State of Search. My name's Tim Shane. I'm a board member at large and the virtual sponsor. So we are broadcasting this standing room only presentation out virtually. The camera's right back there. So at the end, when we have questions and answers, I'll bring the microphone around. It's my pleasure to announce to you Ruth Burr Reedy. She's the CEO of Upbuild, a marketing agency, and she is specializing in technical SEO, advanced web analytics, and whole funnel digital marketing strategy. Ruth has been working in SEO since 2006, including stints at agencies, and as an independent consultant and in-house at companies like Real Networks and Moz. She has been a regular at State of Search. She's been a regular State of Search attendee and speaker since 2012 and is delighted to return. Ruth lives in Oklahoma City with her spouse, kid, and dogs. Let's give a warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Ruth Burr Reedy.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to see all of you here, standing room only. Very excited that you're excited to talk about Screaming Frog. Fun story about me. I do live in Oklahoma City, where I have lived for the last 9 years. The first time I spoke at State of Search, it was the second time I spoke at State of Search, but the first time I spoke at State of Search after I moved to Oklahoma City, I got up and I said, "Boomer Sooner." That did not go over well. People did not like that. So I'm not saying that this time. I also don't care about sports. And I live in Oklahoma, but it turns out there are people who don't care about sports in Oklahoma. Let's talk about Screaming Frog, but first, let's talk about Upbuild. As they said, I'm the CEO of Upbuild. We are a digital marketing agency focused on technical SEO, advanced web analytics, etc. This is my beautiful team. They're wonderful, and I love them all very much. And one member of my team is here today, James McNulty. He's here in the room. He's right there. Hello, James. James helped me build this deck and is also very smart and cool and has a British accent, and you should talk to him. So a few things that we're going to need to implement the tactics that I'm going to talk about today. The first is XPath. For those of you who maybe are not familiar, XPath stands for the XML path language, and it is a path language that you can use to find and select various nodes and elements in an XML document. Briefly, that's what it is. We're also going to need to use regular expressions. I tend to abbreviate it regex. Some people say regex. I don't care how you say it. I say regex with a soft G. The thing about regular expressions is that regular expressions and HTML can be very useful together, but they're not best friends because regular expressions can be very precise and finicky. They are going to do the thing that you told them to do all the way to the thing that you told them to do it. They are not that great at comprehending nuance. And anyone who's worked on a web page can tell you that HTML can be very messy. It is not consistent from website to website, even though it could be if it wanted to. And a lot of websites are not built well. So consistent use of things like IDs, things like classes, things like div and span tags, where they might be helpful to find things with regular expressions or with XPath, not guaranteed. What this means is that in addition to the things that we're going to talk about today, there's a ton of other things that you may be able to use regular expressions to do that I'm not going to be able to explain to you how to do, because it's going to vary so much based on the website that you're using it on. But one tool that I have found really useful when using regular expressions is regex101.com. It's a great place to build out your expressions and test them against a string to see whether or not the expression would actually pull back the string that you were using. And then the last tool that we're going to need for these advanced Screaming Frog tips and tricks today is Screaming Frog. For those of you who somehow came to this talk, even though you're unaware, I love that about you. First of all, the curiosity off the charts. Screaming Frog is a SEO spider tool. It is a tool that you can use to crawl a website and pull out and give you all manner of pieces of information about it. But for today, let's not think of it as Screaming Frog. Let's think of it as Dreaming Frog. Because what we are going to do today is we are going to talk about how you can use Screaming Frog to pull out the pieces of information that are your wildest dreams about what you might like to know about your or anybody else's website. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from this today, it's all of the different things that Screaming Frog can do. We're going to have a lot of screenshots. There's going to be some code. You are going to get the slides after the conference. I double-checked that right before the session. So don't freak out if you can't tell exactly what I might do. If you don't write down the whole line of code, you'll get that later. Instead, focus on what's possible with Screaming Frog and start thinking about how you can use that in your own work. So starting with part one, we're going to talk about all of the different things you can do with my favorite functionality of Screaming Frog, custom search and custom extraction. All of this is going to be found under the configuration menu in Screaming Frog under search and extraction, respectively. Let's start out real simple. Like many people, you probably, as you're building new pages and new websites, especially if you're doing a website relaunch or rebrand or a new site, you might have a time in your life where you're using some placeholder text. And if you're anything like me, the idea that you might launch some of those pages into prod with that placeholder text still in place keeps you up at night just a little bit. You're thinking about it. That's okay. That's good. You can use Screaming Frog really easily to find whether or not there's still placeholder text on a page. You can use this on your staging site, or God help you, on your live site. Just a simple search looking for any page on the site that contains the word lorem ipsum in almost any, not just your standard lorem ipsum text generator, but if you want to use a cute text generator, like I like Cupcake Ipsum, which has a lot of like candy names, it still does use both the words lorem and ipsum. So whatever text generator you can use, look for those placeholder terms and pull out pages. And we've actually found pages on client live sites that use lorem ipsum. This one, I think they built this site in like 2018. They used Trump ipsum, which had some sort of, I would say, off-color phrases that were pulled from our former president's speeches. That was on the live. This is on the live site. A little embarrassing. So this is the kind of thing you can find really easily with Screaming Frog. Number two, just keeping it real simple at first, extracting more than 2 headings per page. So if you've used Screaming Frog's built-in functionality automatically pulls in the H1 and H2 tags off of a page. You don't have to stop there. You can pull in as many heading tags as you have, as many as you want. All you need to use for that is XPath. And this is a very, very simple XPath that just says, anywhere on the page, find an element called H3 and then extract the text. So with custom extraction, there's a few different extraction options. You can extract the internal HTML. In this case, I want to know what those heading tags say on every page down to H4, H5, H6, H12. However far down that rabbit hole you're going, you can set up as many custom extractions as you need to pull that in and get that data. That's especially useful if, like me, you get really up in arms about the use of heading tags instead of CSS styles to style site-wide elements. It's really easy to pull out and say, look at this chart of your footer with an H3 tag in it on every single page of your website. Please fix that. This is kind of a classic Screaming Frog hack, but it's something that I use all the time. Checking tag coverage. The example that I've used here are your GTM, your Google Analytics, and your GA4 tags. It's really easy to create a regular expression to say, look on this page, find this pattern of things. So we're looking for GTM dash and then 0 or more of any character. And that's going to return you your GTM, your GA, your Google Analytics 4 tags. That's great. And this can be really useful with a new client if you suspect they might be running multiple profiles, have multiple instances of a tag. If you don't know what their GTM tag is and no one at the client can tell you, which has happened to me, you can pull it out and say, here are the pages that have this code on them. But for me, what I am often more interested in, and then you can use this regular expression to custom extract and pull out what those tags actually are. For me, I'm often more interested in what pages do not contain that GTM, that GA, whatever tag code you have. It's very easy to just run a search and it will return for you all of the pages that don't contain that code. Now, something that is important to talk about right now is that Screaming Frog is a spider tool. It is a crawl tool. In its default state, it is going to start at whatever URL you give it and crawl along the linked pages to every other page that it can find on the site based on the limits that you set for it. That is a problem when checking for tag coverage because of what? Orphan pages. Which pages on your website are most likely to not have analytics tags on them? Orphan pages. Which pages on your website can Screaming Frog not find? Orphan pages. So when you're checking for tag coverage, what I recommend doing is getting a database export of all of the URLs on your website. If you're using, most CMSs will do this for you, or if you can ask whoever your webmaster or web person is, and they'll just do it for you. Get a list of every URL on the site and then run Screaming Frog in list mode to make sure that you're not overlooking orphan pages when you're looking for tag coverage. Also, that's a good time in terms of your workload to find those orphan pages and ask if they need to be orphans or if they can be brought into the family. This is a fun tip. This is a tip from James. Extract questions from any site's forum. So there are a lot of forums in the world. If you have a topic that matters a lot to a lot of people, chances are the people who are most interested in that topic are interacting with each other in some kind of forum. And that forum may not belong to you, but that doesn't matter because you can still look at it. So what you can do, so the example here is diabetes. Say you want to be creating some new content for people with diabetes. As part of your content planning strategy, you can look at forums for people with diabetes and the questions that they're asking each other and answering for each other and create content to address those questions. Now with this, it's really useful to use the include function in Screaming Frog. What this is going to do, this is under configuration, is you can tell it to only include URLs in its crawl that match this regular expression. So in this case, we're saying we only want to crawl the URLs that are in the forum folder. That's great if you are crawling the forum of a huge website with a lot of content. You don't want to look at their content. You only want to look at the forum. It's a great way to limit that crawl, which will save you time and keep you from getting a lot of irrelevant information you don't care about. Now that we've done that, now that we've set it to include, we're going to write a little XPath. Now, what this XPath says is anywhere in the document, we are going to find text that starts with, but before we look at what it starts with, we want to say, treat all letters as lowercase because we don't want casing to confuse the XPath. So once we're treating every letter as lowercase, we're going to look for text that starts with when. By entering this XPath, it is then going to extract and return the full text string for you and the text of all of those questions. And then you can recreate that XPath for all of your question words, when, what, why, how, who, etc. You can do this as one crawl with lots of crawls. You can set up a ton of custom extractions at the same time. So you could do it all at once if you want. And what you're going to get is this list of questions, and some of them are going to be more useful than others. As with any forum, we have questions like, why did you remove my post talking about a moderating decision? That's what people on forums fight about the most. But you're also, why didn't you answer me, Simon? That's not going to be a great content creation idea for you. But you can also start looking at these questions that people have. Why am I spiking in the afternoon? That's a great content idea. Why am I still so depressed? In and of itself, you're not going to make that the title tag of your post, but diabetes and depression, depression and diabetes, 10 things you didn't know about how diabetes affects depression. Those are all great content ideas. Diabetics in Venezuela. Why does exercise increase blood glucose? These are all things that you can use for content ideas. So it's not like you're going to pull this out and then just say, here's my content calendar, but it's another way to find the real questions that real people are asking and then look for the frequency in those topics to start building out your long-term content strategy. One thing that you can do carefully with Screaming Frog is uncover potential indexing issues looking at how Google is caching a given URL or set of URLs. So if you've been in the search engine results page, you've probably seen this little 3-dot menu next to any given search result. You can click on that, find the About This Result panel, which will show you, among other things, that this URL is cached. If you click on the cached URL, it takes you to a Google server document that has a little message up front that says, here's Google's cache of this URL, and it tells you the date and time in GMT when this was cached. Now, this is a web page, which means that we can, among other things, inspect it in the dev console. So inspecting this element in the dev console, we can see that Google, who knows HTML, has given this a really nice, clear little ID for the whole div, and then each piece of information is contained in a span tag, including this sentence, which is the second span tag in this div. What a beautiful HTML result for us to play with. Because this is so nicely coded, we can then create an XPath that says, on this page, find a div, find an element with this ID, and then within the first div tag, find the second span tag. That's going to pull out the text. If we then pop it into a custom extraction, we can then extract the text from that little span tag from a Google user content URL. Then all we have to do is prepend our list of URLs that we're interested in finding the cache date with this URL and query string parameter, and then fill in the URL that we want to crawl. Fun fact, By doing this, you are crawling Google and scraping Google, and they don't like that. So do this judiciously, because you're probably only going to be able to do it once or twice from a given IP address in a given period before they make you stop. But carefully, intentionally, it is something that you can do. So once you've got your prepended list of URLs, you can use list mode in Screaming Frog, upload those and crawl them, and you'll wind up with a result like this. And you can see, okay, October 2nd, October 9th, October 8th, like all of these URLs were cached around the same time. That's probably not a problem. This URL has not been cached since August 29th, 2022. What's that about? Is that an indexing problem? It's a clue, if nothing else. And by doing that, I would recommend, again, because you have to be a little careful with this, using this when you already suspect you might have indexing issues to spot patterns in your indexing. It is especially great if, like many people, you cannot convince anyone to give you their server logs. Give them to me. You're not even using them. Can confirm.
What would you say is a good limit of URLs to do?
I think it's less the number of URLs. I would do under 200 per crawl, but it's also don't do this a bunch of times in a row or every day. And, if you want to use VPNs, if you want to use IP address spoofing, if you want to change your forwarding header, if you want to do proxy chaining, like there are lots of ways to get around it. So, be careful, but you can do it. One really easy way to use Screaming Frog is to qualify link attributes. So link attributes might communicate a relationship with a link, something that's sponsored content, it's user-generated content. There's also performance attributes, things like pre-render, pre-fetch, pre-connect that you might be using to impact and improve performance. It's really easy with Screaming Frog to find out which pages those are on. One common use case that we've used this for is for clients who have a lot of sponsored or a lot of user-generated content. It's really useful to, especially at the beginning of an arrangement, go in and see, like, are these links tagged correctly? Where are these links? Are there any that aren't tagged correctly, etc. And again, that's just a really, really simple custom search where you're just saying, look for pages that contain this regex, and then whatever your relationship tag is or attribute that you want to extract. And with this case, you're looking in the entire HTML. So that's another thing with custom search. You can search the whole HTML document or just the text area. So if you're looking for something that is a tag or otherwise not on the page, make sure you're searching the full page HTML. But that'll just really easily provide you a list of every page that uses those tags. So those are just some of the many, many things that you can do with custom search and extraction. Like I said, because of the way that regular expressions and HTML are not best friends, there are a lot more things that you can do with your own website if you don't mind spending an hour banging your head against a wall, crafting the perfect regular expression, which is what happens when you use regular expressions to do anything. You can extract so much information about your website. So think about what you want to know, and I bet you can figure out a way to find and extract it. So let's talk about automated tasks. How are we doing on time? So good. No, you slow down, Ryan Jones. I'm too excited. Automated tasks. From talking to people, it seems like a lot of people don't realize how much you can automate using Screaming Frog. You do have to make sure that you are not shutting down the machine on which Screaming Frog is running for days at a time and missing all your automated tasks. But if you are running Screaming Frog on any kind of virtual machine or don't mind leaving your machine on or setting it to the right time, you can automate a lot. And one of the first ones that I want to talk about is automating Google Looker dashboards. Remember when Google Looker was called Google Data Studio because it was a data studio brought to you by Google, and that made sense for a product name. Remember that? That was fun. Now it's called Google Looker. So all of these automated tasks are going to be under File, Scheduling, right here in Screaming Frog. So we're creating a task, and every time you create an automated task, you have an opportunity to name it. You can add a project name, which is really nice if you have multiple clients. You can divide them up by project, and then you're going to set the date and time and how often you want to run it. So this is actually, in the last year, Screaming Frog has updated their functionality around Google Looker in order to make it sort of more built-in and more streamlined. So I don't recommend running this crawl every day because I don't think that day-to-day information is usually a good way to chart dashboards in general. I mean, it depends on what you're doing. But anyway, set a frequency that makes sense for you. Weekly or monthly is probably fine. One thing to note with all automated tasks in Screaming Frogs is that you can load this configuration file. This is great. Otherwise, it's just going to run the default out-of-the-box spider configuration. That might be fine. But if you want to do things like add an include or an exclude, like we talked about earlier, if you want to change the pieces of data that are or not extracted and how they are displayed, if there are things that you don't care about and you want to speed up the crawl, or areas of the site that you want to look at or not look at, if you want to change, the maximums or minimums, you can also change things like how many characters should a title tag be, and things like that. All of the different configuration options that you can use in Screaming Frog, you can then export into a config file and then have it configure your automated tasks to do that same configuration so you don't have to manually enter that every time. Then we're going to go to the export. You have to use headless mode in order to do the rest of this, so it's going to make you check that box. I recommend, if you haven't already, connecting your Google Drive account so that you can then be exporting sheets directly into Google Drive or into Google Sheets. And then down at the bottom, you'll see that they actually have, this is the latest version of Screaming Frog. It does still say export for Data Studio. I assume that version 17.3 or whatever will say Looker. And you can say custom crawl overview, and there's a little gear tab to configure it, where we'll show you all of the things that Screaming Frog usually extracts in a crawl, and you can say which ones you want. Now for the custom crawl overview, in my opinion, there's no reason not to just click this little double arrow and track everything, because it's not going to take that much more time or processing power to do, depending on your website as always. But might as well track everything if you're going to be tracking this. And what this is going to do over time is every interval that you've set, daily, weekly, monthly, it's going to run a crawl, and it's going to pull out the aggregated summary numbers of each metric that it crawls. So things like total URLs, errors, page titles, all of the things that Screaming Frog usually pulls out, it's going to just pull up into a nice summary that's just one row of data in a Google Sheet. And so over time, you'll have more and more rows of data. And what that will allow you to do is start charting some of these metrics over time. And what do we do when we chart things over time? We create a dashboard. So in Google Data Studio, you can then in Google Looker, you can then hook up the Google Sheet that you're exporting this data into, and then use that to drive a dashboard. Great news about this scheduling task is that once you've got that set up, you can then hit duplicate, and then all you have to do is change which website it's crawling, and you can set this up for all of your clients. And depending on how many clients you have, you can set this all up in about an hour. That allows you to build dashboards that can look like this. So over time, you can look at things like the total number of URLs you're finding, your indexability. Indexability is a word that Ryan Jones loves. Internal HTML over time, whatever metrics you care about graphing over time. Just because you're capturing them in your sheet doesn't mean you have to include them in your dashboard. But whatever your client cares about, your data stakeholders care about, you can start charting those over time, which is great. However, sometimes what we want in a dashboard is not metrics over time in aggregate. Sometimes we want individual pieces of data, and that is going to not be represented here. Sometimes a client looks at that and says, well, wait, what happened there? What happened there? And sometimes there are individual pieces of data that we want to get a little bit more granular around. We can do that too, and just in automated fashion. So we create a new task. I called this one 404 errors because that's what we're tracking. We'll load our config file. Now for this, we're overwriting files in output. In general, if you only care about the most recent crawl, you might as well set it to overwrite files so you don't have a million files. And then in bulk export, we're going to say, okay, what do we want? I only care about which pages are throwing a 404 error for the purposes of this example, for the purposes of this pretend dashboard. That's going to create a really nice little Google Sheet right here in my Google Drive. Looks like that. I can hook that up to Google Looker just as easily as my other sheet and pull in the pieces of data around those 404 errors that Screaming Frog is populating that sheet with, and create a nice little list of what's going on right now. So you can see right here, this is a bunch of stuff on the staging site. But this gives us a good idea of what is happening and where we are still kicking up errors. That then over time, if we're working to reduce those 404 errors, we can look at the dashboard and say, here are the remaining pages that are still kicking up an error. You can do that with any piece of data and have it be just as automated. You only have to do it once, and then you can look at that dashboard. I like to, this is something that a lot of people do. I think with all of these automated tasks, it's really useful to, within the dashboard, remind yourself and your clients about when this updates so that they're not like, why isn't this different? Well, is it Friday? No. So it's the same as it was last time you looked at it 2 days ago, which was also not Friday. This is a tip that I just came across as I was doing research for this talk. You can automate XML sitemap generation. A lot of websites are on a CMS that's going to do that automatically. If you're on WordPress, if you're on Shopify, if you're on a lot of the major CMSs, chances are you have some kind of plugin generating an automated XML sitemap. If you are on some kind of, God help you, custom CMS, you may not have the capacity to do that via a plugin. You can use Screaming Frog to do that. This is a tip to credit where credit's due that I read about in a blog post by a guy named Logan Ray, right there on the Screaming Frog website. If you want to read the post, it's linked in my slides. But to do this, you can just automate an XML sitemap crawl. Then you're going to set the output to create XML sitemap, intuitive. And then you can, and this is another SEO, like it depends area. How we're going to do this depends on a lot of stuff, but you can then use reverse proxies to push this data to a place that is live and accessible on a web server that your website can then find. You can then use reverse proxies to set your sitemap.xml page to pull in information from this automatically updated sheet on a regular basis. Here's a chart about reverse proxies that I included because I felt like I needed a slide about this, but it's too complicated to explain in the next 15 minutes. So we're custom extracting, we're custom searching, we're automating tasks, we're feeling very good about ourselves. Part 3, here are some other things. I originally called this section other cool things you can do. It is now called scale and compare, which is slightly more descriptive, but not that much more. So here's something that sometimes happens. You're running Screaming Frog. You're like, this crawl is going to take a little while. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do work for another client. You open your work for another client. You're like, oh, I need to do a Screaming Frog crawl for them too. Well, crap. What you can do, you can run multiple instances of Screaming Frog at the same time on the same machine. Why not? Why wouldn't you? We have so much RAM. I only know how to do this on a Mac. You can probably do it on a PC too. Look it up. On a Mac, as you may or may not know, you can open any application you want from the terminal if for some reason you don't feel like clicking on something. So you can use this little opener. You can just type this into terminal and it will open Screaming Frog as many times as you want, but you don't have to copy and paste this every time. Once you have done this once, you can use Mac's built-in automator functionality to create a quick action and run a shell script that will do this for you in terminal whenever you want. Once you've created this shell script in Automator, it is a simple matter of going into keyboards and creating a keyboard shortcut, which you can do in the services menu. And then you can just have a simple little key shortcut and you don't have to find this and copy and paste it or type it in every time. Easy to do. Set it up once, run Screaming Frog at the same time, as many times as you want. Now, you might be saying to yourself, Screaming Frog already really bogs down my computer, to which I say, I know, which is why if you have a computer with a solid state drive, you should really be crawling in database storage mode. This is something that a surprising number of people seem to not know about, but it is very useful. See, this guy knows because he crawls big sites. It's very useful if you are crawling a large site, if you are consistently hitting that RAM limit. If you're like, this crawl is going to take 2 days of my computer not doing anything. Database storage mode is going to help. It's not going to fully solve, but it will help you with these problems. So to get into database storage mode, go to configuration, system, storage mode, very easy. And you can go to database storage. And what that's going to allow you to do is instead of storing all of this information in your RAM, it is instead going to store it directly to a database on your computer. A couple of other things that are really nice about this, it may not be quite as fast depending on your computer, but if like me, you live in tornado country and you lose power all the time, running in database storage mode is going to mean that you are not going to lose whatever of your crawl you had so far because it's automatically committing it to the database. You don't have to manually save your crawl once it's completed. And that has saved me on more than one occasion. You will also need to be running in database storage mode for this next thing, which is my last tip. Tracking changes. So you can use Screaming Frog's track changes mode. It's not called that. It's called compare mode to track changes for your clients. If you have clients who are not great at telling you when they push things to prod, you can start automating a crawl on a regular basis and then use the compare function to see what's changed since the last time you ran that crawl. If you have a client or if you are in-house at a place where they've got that one competitor that they're just like, they're like frenemies, they're like friends and enemies, they're obsessed with them, they're maybe a little bit in love, they think about them all the time. Yes, you know the competitor. I can see in your eyes, many of you have a competitor in mind. You can do the same thing to them. It's not your website, that doesn't matter. You can crawl anybody's website you want with Screaming Frog. And that allows you to, if they have had big changes or something happens, maybe they're ranking for a bunch of new stuff, or they've taken over the SERP for something they didn't have the SERP for before, or whatever thing it is that now your client is very upset about. If you are on a regular basis running and storing crawls for this competitor, you can very quickly say, well, what changed? What changed between then and now that could be a clue, because correlation isn't causation, could be a clue as to why this is happening. So to do this, you're going to need to run in compare mode. If you are not in database storage mode, it's going to make you change to database storage mode before you can do this whole process. Once you're in database storage mode, it will prompt you to add some crawls. Now, if you've just started using database storage mode, maybe you have some crawls that you've already run and saved that you want to use, but you haven't committed them to the database. You just saved them in that .seo spider file type. Great news. If you first open up your crawls, it might look real empty because you've never done this before, but it is very easy to import SEO spider files. So if you have 2 crawls of the same website, you can very easily import them and turn them into database crawls. You could also compare 2 crawls of a different website, but what Screaming Frog is going to tell you is this is 2 different websites. They're not the same at all, which you don't really need Screaming Frog to tell you. You should already know that. But you can import, so this is 2 crawls of the same website. You can import and and then you can select each of these for comparison mode. So once you've got your web crawls imported, or maybe you've been running in database mode and you can just pull them in, there's one more step that you should do before comparing, and that's tell Screaming Frog what you want to compare, which you can do in configuration. You may not care about all of this stuff. The fewer things you compare, the faster it's going to be, although that rate of change may be negligible depending on how big the crawls are. One thing to note is down here at the bottom, you can look at content and you can tell it within a certain similarity threshold when to flag that as on-page content having changed. This is great because by default, compare mode is only going to compare those metrics around different pieces of data that Screaming Frog collects by default. So it may not flag a change in something like title tag unless it has hit one of those thresholds, missing, over whatever character limit you've set, duplicate, etc. If you want to be tracking changes in things like on-page content, you do need to make sure that as you're setting up that initial crawl, you're setting it to extract and store the HTML of the page. It doesn't do that by default because it takes a lot more data and a lot more time. So you have to set it up to do that. And again, think about how often you're running this crawl because this is going to be more data that you're storing in your solid state drive. So also practice good database hygiene, clear out stuff you don't need anymore. But over time, if you are storing this HTML information, you can run these crawls. This is, and it'll hit you back with charts like this that tell you, okay, the current site has a lot more HTML documents than it did before. It's a lot more images than it did before. I know because we did that on purpose. But that's good to know. But it will also tell you the change, and it will tell you how many pages had changes in things like word count, crawl depth, etc. You'll notice this area of the chart is blank, so this is what it looks like when you have not extracted that extra data. If you're not extracting the HTML, it doesn't have it, so it can't compare it. No one's talking to you, Siri. So that is really great if you want to not spy on, because it's publicly available information. It's their website. If you want to keep track of what your clients or your competitors are doing, this is a great way to just, again, you can set that up in an automated crawl, have it running in the background, and then if you need it, you've got it, and you can compare. You can even use that to build your own dashboards, again, in Data Studio, in Looker, or whatever other dynamic dashboarding tool you might use. So that's a lot of tips that I went through pretty fast. It was a lot of screenshots. And like I said at the beginning, you will be able to get these slides later. And I hope that you go home and you do as many of these things as are useful to you. But what I really hope is that coming out of this presentation, you will believe in the power of your own dreams. You believe in the power of Dreaming Frog, because really what I want you to understand is just how granular it is possible to get, how much extra data you can extract from your websites and use to derive usable insights from a tool that chances are you're already paying for. So please do that. If you have a really cool use of Screaming Frog that you're like dying to tell me about, please come up to me and tell me about it. I want to hear about it. And otherwise come up to me and say, hi, I'm very nice and friendly. And that's my talk. So I think we got some time for questions.
Awesome. Great job. All right. What questions do we have? You covered everything.
I covered everything. Did you have a question?
Yes. How much of that applies to the paid version versus free?
Almost all of it applies to the paid version and not the free version. So,
How much of what you just discussed applies to the paid or?
almost all of it, yeah.
There's only like 150 bucks.
Of the available SEO tools on the market, I think that it is the most useful for like that use to cost ratio is the best.
With content teams that are deploying websites, if you had to name 3 tools and from the best to the third, which would you rank Screaming Frog, and what other tools would you compare for that team to be effective in terms of site deployments?
When you say content teams that are deploying websites, do you mean new websites or publishing content on existing websites?
Sports polishes and new websites.
Okay, and what are you trying to do with that information?
Well, retain URL structure, get into sites that have a lot of pages that they're not, not have WordPress access to, but they're already starting the stage, those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I love Screaming Frog. Screaming Frog's main limitation is that if you get up over, into the hundreds of thousands or millions of URLs, it just takes a lot longer to use to a point that can really reduce its utility. So if you are in that situation, a tool like Botify or whatever deep crawl is called now, it's not Lumen because that's the company from Severance, but it's something like that. Loomer.
I got an email from the other day.
Yeah, it's probably Lemur. That's probably what it is. It's Lemur. Yeah, so I mean, that is when you have to get into those more enterprise level tools. In terms of just like big websites, just because you're sitting next to Duncan, like using stat to track your overall keyword coverage, I think, especially with a huge site and when you're deploying a lot of content, is really important.
Hey, Ruth, thank you. So quick question. When it comes to pulling data into Data Studio, what's the advantage of using a Screaming Frog rather than, like, let's say, pulling data from SEMrush or Ahrefs?
Why do you have to pick one?
I was just wondering personally, if there was an advantage of using that.
So, I mean, the main advantage of Screaming Frog first of all, I feel like SEMrush and Ahrefs are kind of apples and oranges with Screaming Frog. Like a lot of what I'm looking at with Screaming Frog has more to do with structure as opposed to performance. And Ahrefs, I mostly am looking at for like link data, and that comes with like link graph data, which I don't use Screaming Frog for. But very, very briefly, you have to pay for APIs. Whereas Screaming Frog, you've already paid for it and you can use it as much as you want. So that is the fun thing about Screaming Frog as opposed to like SEMrush, where I love pulling SEMrush data into Screaming Frog and into Data Studio, and I have to be really careful that I don't spend a lot of money doing it. Whereas with Screaming Frog, I can just splash around in the data all I want.
What is the biggest differentiator though with SEMrush and Ahrefs? Just take SEMrush versus Screaming Frog. I'm trying to understand the same thing.
I use both.
You said that it's apples and oranges. If you could just expand on that specifically then.
Yeah, so with Screaming Frog, a lot of what I'm looking at is about the site structure. I do pull in things like keyword use. You can use the custom extraction to extract content and then run it through some of the processes and tools that Ryan was talking about in his talk in terms of mapping it to n-grams and pulling out entities and making sure it's about the things that you say it's about, which is not what you asked me. I just think it's cool. With SEMrush, I am mostly using SEMrush for either high-level keyword data, that keyword versus competition. So for SEMrush, I'm less looking at the website in terms of its structure and on-page factors, and more looking at how it's performing in the web, especially compared to competitors, looking at sort of overall organic search view, and then using it as a factor in keyword research and keyword discovery, which is another thing you can't really do with your own website, because you're trying to make changes to your website and do new things with your website. There's only so much information about your current site that's going to help you do those things.
So first a comment, because someone mentioned about it taking forever to crawl. One of the smartest things my team ever did was put Screaming Frog in the cloud.
Yep.
Fire up an Azure server, and we created our own compare tool based on their database files. But I'm crawling like 10 Fortune 100 websites a month, like twice a week, and it's like $40 a month in cloud usage fees to do that. So it's super cost effective. My question for you is, when you want to do all that Google scraping stuff, do you have any recommendations for proxies or ways to get around it?
Well, I mean, I just went to a really interesting talk that was about sort of, among other things, this site called SEO DataViz that I think has some really good tools around data scraping and visualization that you can use. Yeah.
You can still use some proxies on that site, though.
We'll talk later.
Thank you.
The answer is we'll talk later. Yeah.
I'll say on that, visual plane is pretty good. It basically, you can like highlight an area of a website, have it do actions. So I track a lot of knowledge panel changes. So when I'm tracking knowledge panel changes, I'll like have it go to Google, have it type a search, and scan a certain area where the knowledge panel isn't changed. I can't like do things like the Screaming Frog though, where you're tracking multiple, but you can do like email alerts.
Yeah, like one off, and yeah, if you have a very specific task, that's a lower load for sure.
I kind of mentioned to you earlier as well, one of the things that people don't think about using this for sometimes is dev teams. And I've had instances where dev teams don't really have a good ability to search for certain code elements to find, especially when they're not on every page. And I end up using Screaming Frog to go, okay, those broken A tags are on these 1,000 pages. And if you pull the data right, you can actually even pull out where, again, paragraph 6 in the body of this is where the thing is broken and you need to go fix it. So it's not only for SEO. You can use it for devs as well.
I think for content teams as well, one of the things we often see in sites with a lot of technical debt is a lot of unnecessary internal 301 redirects, because they haven't made a policy of updating their internal links every time they redirect a page. And then we come in and say, you've got all of these really unnecessary redirects that could just not be there. And they say, well, we'd have to go in and find every page that links to every one of these redirecting URLs. And it's like, well, I did that with Screaming Frog, and here it is. And here's the list of the pages, and here's the anchor text of each link. And just get your lowest paid content person to go through this spreadsheet line by line for the next week, and it'll be done. And then going forward, don't do that anymore.
Question here in the back.
This is fun. This is a fun conversation.
This is not necessarily a question, but just to add on, I've used Screaming Frog already to look for link opportunities where you look for specific text that you need links for, and you can have it pull it out and tell you exactly where it is. And you can even kind of stack it and say, does this page already contain a link? So
Are you talking about scraping other sites you want links from, or your own site for internal sites?
To look for internal links.
Yeah.
So you look for specific anchor text and look if the page already has a link on it.
Yeah, I love that. Yes.
Screaming Frog, but the upgrade Screaming Frog I use all the time. I'm a forensic SEO recovery person, but also Sitebulb, because it's $35 a month, and it does a little different than Screaming Frog. So I use both, and then Sitebulb has a lot of graphs and a lot of ability to filter data that Screaming Frog doesn't have. So, but they're both awesome, and I always use both. But it's cheap, like the other ones that are more expensive.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of times the other ones that are more expensive, that sort of graph and data viz ability is what they're selling on, and you can get most of that from Screaming Frog pretty easily. You just have to do a couple of extra steps, but Sitebulb is a great lower cost tool that has some of that functionality built in for sure. And it will run when your machine's not on, which it will also do if you run Screaming Frog in the cloud or in a virtual machine. There are a lot of different ways to do it, but you just think about it.
Oh,
that's nice.
Where it'll actually, here's the error, and you click on the page, and it'll actually highlight the exact bit of HTML that's causing the error.
Again, that's really good for dev teams.
Yeah, it's good for kind of spoon feeding where the result is. Their code coverage is awesome.
Awesome. Well, Ruth, we want to give you this gift for coming out and speaking again. Thank you so much. And let's have a big welcome and warm hand for Ruth Burr Reedy. And as she said, we'll get the slide decks if you guys make your way back to the main room. It's almost time for the